Most of us have a traditional Christmas movie, right? One that your family always watches every year, and that probably says something about you, whether it's Miracle on 34th Street or whatnot. For my family, for myself and Nicole, it has always been Christmas Vacation. It just is the way we roll. And one scene in particular seemed like the right one to me. As you recall, in the movie, after an epic showdown with his Christmas lights display, right? Chevy Chase's character, Clark Griswold, cannot get these things to shine. And if you looked at the wiring they were doing, maybe it's best for them not to turn it on because that is certainly not safe. But finally, after all of his meltdown, it's lit up and everyone is out on the lawn enjoying the lights. And of course, his father-in-law says the lights aren't twinkling, Clark, to remind him that even in his victory, it's not complete. At that moment, Cousin Eddie shows up, played quite memorably in the movie by Randy Quaid, to add his family to their already packed house and his RV rust bucket to the driveway. At which point, Chevy Chase's character famously says, "If I woke up tomorrow with my head sewn to the carpet, I couldn't be more surprised than I am right now." And I found that to be quite memorable and quite hilarious. Our next witnesses to Advent are, in a sense, unexpected, uninvited, much like the shepherds on Christmas Eve, but delayed as well. And so let's take a look at our last witnesses. This is the sixth part of this impromptu series I made up this year. We're going to look at the Magi, starting in Matthew chapter 2, familiar passage. Verse 1 says, "After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod." Our nativity scenes, we love nativity scenes. We've got one right in front here, another one, a couple of them out in the hallway. They always have everything happening at the same time, right on the night of Jesus' birth. You've got Mary and Joseph and the baby, you've got the shepherds, you've got the Magi. Everybody's there. Camels, cows, sheep, everything, right? One big scene. And that's, of course, harmless enough. That's just a display, a reminder of the symbolism. But Matthew is describing for us events that took place as much as 2 years later. And we'll learn about that timing in a bit. It says in Bethlehem. Bethlehem, of course, the city of David. The city where Ruth met Boaz. The city where Jacob buried his beloved Rachel. In other words, the proper place for a new king of Israel to be born. Except, it says during the time of King Herod, they already have a king with air quotes, as we like to do these days for things we don't consider legitimate. The Romans have a puppet named Herod, and his administration is both efficient and cruel. His high taxes have paid for the massive temple renovations that will last decades, and which same renovations Jesus' disciples will one day marvel at and say, "Look at this place. This is amazing." Herod will die in 4 BC. A paranoid man at the end with murderous intent. We'll talk about that as well. So that is the setting for this morning's message. It says that Magi came from the east to Jerusalem. Magi is a term used in this era for all sorts of people interested in things like astronomy or dream interpretation or magic, some of whom were, of course, probably charlatans using this title, this term, as a way to make money, but others, like these, were generally interested in studying these things. The supernatural, they wanted to know. Of course, in our song this morning, we called them 3 kings. The tradition of calling them kings goes all the way back to Tertullian, an early church father from the 3rd century. In other words, only a couple hundred years after this, Tertullian was calling them kings. We don't know where that came from, but that was his conviction. We also say we 3 kings, and that's just an assumption from the fact that there were 3 gifts. We figure 3 gifts, 3 kings, right? Maybe they went halvesies, right, on the gold. Maybe it was too much. We do that all the time for Christmas presents, right? Go in on them to make it work. That might have been what was happening. Whether they were 3, whether they were kings, we're not sure. But by the 6th century, church tradition had also said, you know what? They've got names. And they called them Melchior and Balthasar and Gaspar. We don't know where that came from, but they were 1,400 years closer to the events than we were. Maybe they knew something. Maybe an oral tradition had been preserved. But Matthew, in his telling of it, is satisfied with just using the plural, magi, instead of magus. He just told us that there were more than one. That was all he needed to know. For Matthew, the important piece of information is not about the men, but about their journey, about the fact that they came here for a purpose. We're told that simply they came from the east. That could mean Babylon, where there was a large Jewish community that remained there since the exile, or it could simply mean off on the other side of the Fertile Crescent somewhere. They asked, "Where is the one who was born King of the Jews?" These men it seems, familiar with Jewish prophecies, that the Jewish people believed in the coming of a Messiah. They were certain enough of their astrological observations from what they saw in the night sky that they went to the capital of the province. They went to Jerusalem, expecting to find a baby there with all the trappings of long-anticipated royal birth. They assumed that others were already celebrating this, that this was known. We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. People have long speculated about what they saw, right? Some have said in church history, different philosophers and theologians and even astronomers, that it was an alignment of the planets. Or others have said that it was a supernova, and those can shine brightly in the sky for a limited time. Others have speculated that perhaps God just did something unique, something that didn't leave a trace, something that's not observable in our sky today. Doesn't really matter. Whatever it was, it got their attention. It convinced them that this is important enough to pack their bags and make a long journey. And why have they come? Our text says they've come to worship him. That word might not mean everything to them that it means to us. It means they recognize that this child is something special, and they're going to pay him homage. They're going to show him deference and honor, because they don't know anything about this new Jewish king, except that a heavenly sign has told them that he's been born, and that was enough for them. Their easy faith, their easy belief, they saw it, they came, will contrast in our story strongly with the stubbornness of Herod and the religious leaders in Jerusalem. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed in all Jerusalem with him. I'm thinking Matthew is being polite by saying disturbed because it was probably worse. Of course, Herod was upset. He's pretending to be the king of the Jews because the Roman army backs him. But the people don't love him, even though he's spent his entire time rebuilding this temple with their tax money. They don't love him. They consider him an outsider, an usurper. He's not really even Jewish. He married into a family that was connected to the Hasmonean dynasty, to the Maccabeans from of old, to try to get legitimacy. But they're never going to think of him as their king. They're never going to love him. We also know from historians that paranoia will lead Herod to murder one of his wives and two of his sons because he believed they were plotting against him to steal his throne before his time was ended. Maybe they were, we don't know. Murdered his own family in order to hold on to the throne. Is there going to be any hesitation at all from this man about murdering a child he cares nothing for? No, not the least. Which makes the fear of the people of Jerusalem understandable. They know the kind of man Herod is. How many people are going to get killed because of Herod's desire to maintain his grip on power? They know that murder is coming. Rome also doesn't like or tolerate riots. What if Herod's anger gets out of hand? What if this leads to riots in the streets? The legions will be coming. Yeah, the people of Jerusalem are afraid. He had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law. He asked them where the Messiah was to be born. These are the religious leaders of Jerusalem. Some of them cooperate with Herod and Rome. They're pragmatists and say, what else can we do? Others would gladly see him gone, but there's nothing they can do about it. All of them are aware of the messianic prophecies in Scripture. They have been discussed, they have been scrutinized by leading rabbis for centuries. And there are a variety of opinions that have resulted from that discussion. But some of the details are generally accepted. Some of the things everybody agrees on, and one of them is where the Messiah will be born. And so they answer him, in Bethlehem in Judea, they replied, for this is what was written by this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people, Israel. When they answered him, they responded by quoting part of Micah 5:2 and part of 2 Samuel 5:2. Their answer wasn't a tricky one. The Messiah would, of course, sit on David's throne and reestablish his dynasty. It would only be natural and symbolically powerful for him to be born in David's hometown. Without Micah's prophecy, Bethlehem would still be the natural choice for where the Messiah would be born. And so, thus, they have their answer. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. If we were to keep going today to verse 16, we would understand that that answer was about 2 years, because that's the number that Herod's going to work with. The Magi may have thought this just a curiosity, right? I mean, he wants to know how old the kid is. It's just curiosity. We'd all want to know that. But we know Herod already is scheming to have this child murdered. He didn't ask them publicly about this, perhaps because he was concerned that the people that know the kind of man he is, right? These guys don't know him, but the people that know him would put two and two together if they found out that Herod wanted to know how old the child was. Maybe they'd send a messenger running to Bethlehem to say, get everybody 2 or younger out of here. But Herod kept that secret. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him. There is zero sincerity in this request. As I thought about this week, all of those cartoons I watched as a child popped into my mind, and I picture Herod with a mustache twirling the end of it as he does this. He's got to indicate to the audience, hey, I'm a villain, right? I'm up to something. I'm going to go and worship him. Yeah, sure. There is nothing in Herod's life, either the biblical account, which is pretty damning, or what the historians like Josephus have told us, that would lead us to believe that his patronage of the temple and his participation in Jewish festivals, of course he went to them and made a show of being there, were anything other than what a politician would do. performing for the masses. That's common enough. Powerful people down through the centuries have always participated in the things their people have believed in, whether they themselves have any care about that or not. After they'd heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. And so traveling at night, the Magi continue on. It's not a very long journey from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. And guided by the star, which points to Bethlehem as the prophecy foretold, they finally arrive. Their long journey here has ended. And now the Magi are about to witness a birth of astrological proportions. You'd be overjoyed if studying the stars was your passion, and you saw something in the stars that had a connection to events here on earth. You would be amazed by that. It would be the highlight and the high point of your entire career. And so it was for them. They find the child. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. As is the custom in the ancient Near East, you bring a gift and you do an act of homage when you when you meet a king. And so these men treat the child as a king. We don't know what they understood about Jesus. We don't know what Mary and Joseph told them about him. I'm sure they had questions, right? How did this come to be? What's going on? Did Mary tell them about the angelic visit? I don't know. Matthew is focused on the recognition of the Messiah by Gentiles because that's an important theme. It echoes the prophecies of Psalm 72 and Isaiah 60, verse 6. So Matthew doesn't tell us what happens to these men and what they believed about this child. But I think it would be consistent with the grace that Jesus brought to this earth if they believed in him after seeing him, if this was a permanent change in their lives. There's much speculation about the symbolism of these gifts, and you can find that if you're interested in it. Actually, We Three Kings, the hymn, talks about that symbolism. However, these are simply typical gifts of royalty for that era of history. That could just be they brought something expensive, something significant. Matthew doesn't tell us what Joseph and Mary did with these treasures. What happened to the gold, frankincense, and myrrh? Maybe they used it to pay for that time in Egypt that they had to spend hiding from Herod. And verse 12 is the end. It says, and having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. God shows them grace by keeping them away from Herod. Having accomplished what they set out to do, they returned to their lives, hopefully now men of faith. Thus our nativity scene is complete, a year or two after the manger. And Matthew will continue with a brief story of the sojourn of Joseph and Mary and the child in Egypt. Luke will add for us a story about the time Jesus was 12 and he was lost in the temple. But other than those two brief things, and Luke telling us about the naming of the child, which we didn't cover in our witness journey here, other than that, we won't see Jesus again until he's about 30 years old. We'll know much of anything about his childhood, his teenage years, his young adult years. We will see him next when he is publicly ministering, when he begins his 3-year journey towards his passion. So what do we learn from the Magi and their witness to the Advent? Number one, we recognize that God is always doing more in our world than we realize. When the shepherds showed up, they might have thought, well, that was quite the thing. And yet, 2 years later, here are the Magi. God was doing something that had a long-term effect to it. Secondly, The Magi could see that God was doing something important. Their eyes were open to what God was doing in this world. While, of course, Herod, who had a lot more information about this, could not see that. His heart was closed. Thirdly, then, we don't have to search the heavens for clues. Our journey for months to find the Savior. He's accessible and open to all who seek him.